president, obviously, from the White House on the one side. You see protests in other parts of Washington, D.C. on the other, just a block or so away. The curfew did just take place at 7 o'clock, and obviously it is not being adhered to. As we wait to see what the president's going to do there and the protesters, I want to go to Caitlin Collins overlooking the church where the president is headed now. So, Caitlin, what have you been able to see here?
Yeah, Aaron, well, this is really notable because we've been up here. We saw these protesters moved so quickly out of this park here. I mean, it was maybe minutes. They gave 3 warnings. Those warnings came within minutes of one another. And then you started seeing these officers who have been standing in the park all day start to move in on these protesters. And then they started to move them down the street. And there were several lines of officers, Aaron, some on horse, some on foot. They had batons, shields, tear gas, and flashbangs. And they moved these protesters, almost all of them, out of in front of the White House within 10 minutes. It raised questions of whether or not they were doing that because the president was out to speak in the Rose Garden. And now we're learning it's because the president wanted to come over to this church right here that is behind me. I'm going to step to the side so you can see St. John's Church right here. This is what part of it caught on fire last night, though the rector said today it could have been much worse than the damage they actually fared. You can't see a ton of damage from the front, though we are told the backside of it was on fire. But it's notable that the president is coming over here after they just moved all of these peaceful protesters out of the way. They had been chanting George Fuller's name, chanting that Black Lives Matter, but there had not been any acts of violence or aggression that we saw. And Aaron, the Secret Service just came up here where we are. You can see them. You can see the Secret Service is up here on the roof with us now of the Hay Adams Hotel. This is where we've been broadcasting live from. We did not have any heads up that the Secret Service was going to be coming up here. And now they're over here looking over the streets. And I want to note, right over here to my left, I'm seeing there are mounted horses, and you can still see some protesters. To the right, you see the president and several officials, and of course, a massive security detail walking through the park. We're going to move our camera over a little. There is a helicopter flying overhead, 2 of them actually that we can see right now. And this is notable. I'm not sure the president has ever walked over from the White House to St. John's before. I believe the last time he came here, he was in a motorcade. And now you can see a ton of Secret Service and aides walking through the park as the president is making his way over to visit this church that was part of the fires last night.
All right, Caitlin, so, please stay with us here as we watch this. And everyone, you can see here, the camera's trying to catch up. The president doing this unprecedented moment in so many respects, breaking up peaceful protesters with flashbangs and rubber bullets, saying that he is going to invoke for the first time in more than 200 years an act allowing U.S. military deployment on U.S. shores against Americans. You see the president walking there. Jeffrey Toobin is with me on the phone. So Jeff, obviously you see the president walking across to St. John's Episcopal Church, all of this massive security presence around him. This is an unprecedented moment.
It certainly is, and I think it's important when we talk about the president's authority to draw a distinction here. The president basically has carte blanche to bring the military into the District of Columbia. The District of Columbia is not a state, and the president can bring in the military if he likes. It's a very different story in the 50 states. The act he's talking about, it has the name, the very evocative name of the Insurrection Act of 1807, and it says the president can bring in the military. However, it says it must be at the request of a state government. So I don't know exactly what their justification is if they think they can just send the military in to a state, because that is not prohibited. It is not allowed. It's well established. There's another similarly old law called the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that the American military cannot be involved in law enforcement. The Insurrection Act is a kind of exception to that, but it is only at the request of a state government. And as far as I'm aware, no states, including, of course, Minnesota, have asked for the military to come in. So we'll have to see how that develops.
To your point, Jeffrey, and you just explained it so perfectly, it does explain his phrasing, right? He brought them into Washington. Looks like he may be about to speak here. We will watch that as a moment. But he did say that that every governor must deploy their full National Guard, and if they don't, he will deploy the U.S. military and quickly solve the problem for them. That's what he said. Now he's standing there looking around after what was, frankly, a pretty undignified approach to St. John's Episcopal Church, he's holding up a Bible, walking by some graffiti saying "No Justice, No Peace" and FTP, which people can figure out what that stands for. Holding up a Bible.
We have a great country. That's my thoughts. This country is great. It won't take long. It's not going to take long. You see what's going on. It's coming back. It's coming back strong. It'll be greater than ever before.
Shouted out questions to the president as he is there across the street, as we said, with his staff, massive security detail holding up a Bible. I'm just listening here along with everyone else, just to pause here for a moment of the president setting up this photo op for himself, dispersing peaceful protesters to do so in front of a boarded up church, which had that fire due to the protests last evening. You can see him standing there. I think it's important just to talk about the image. He sees this as his big photo. You saw him sort of, caring about the moment and the photo, now bringing everybody in here for his photo op. That's what this is all about for him. It's Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. As he does this, and I will, Bill Barr, the Attorney General, who we saw coming in, we're going to continue to monitor this and listen. While we do that, I'm going to bring in the Governor of Illinois, Governor J.B. Pritzker. Governor, you were on the phone with the president today. You had some strong words. I want to ask you about that, but first, what do you say? You just heard Jeffrey Toobin, president, saying he is going to mobilize the U.S. military to go into states, deploy them quickly to solve the problem for them if they won't do it. That they are the governors. You are one of them. What do you say to the president?
Well, first of all, I reject the notion that the federal government can send troops into the state of Illinois. The fact is that the president has created an incendiary moment here. He wants to change the subject from his failure over coronavirus, a miserable failure, and now seeing a moment when there is unrest because of the injustice that was done to George Floyd, that he now wants to create another topic and something where he can be the law and order president. He's been a miserable failure. What I talked about on the call today was the fact that his rhetoric is inflaming passions around the nation. He should be calling for calm. He should be calling for bringing the temperature down. He's doing the exact opposite.
Well, Governor, what he just did was hold up a Bible, making it clear that that's what he stands for. He's the, I don't know, what words would you put on it? God is behind him. He's the president of law and order and of godliness. What do you make of that very bizarre moment?
Look, he continually lies. The fact is that God is on the side of those who stand up for American values, those who stand up for freedom, those who stand up for the rights of everyone in our nation. And that means standing up for the peaceful protesters. You saw what he did to the peaceful protesters. Those are federal troops under his command. He obviously wanted them pushed back. He wanted to create a moment. He wanted tear gas in the streets in Washington, D.C., so that he could look like he needs to bring order to the nation. And the fact is that he should stay out of our business. We are working hard in the state of Illinois to bring down tensions. And look, every day he has inflamed racial tension.
Is there anything, Governor, that would, in your mind, justify what just happened, which is peaceful protesters there were rubber bullets, there was tear gas, there were flashbangs, they were moved out, right? They were peaceful. There had been nothing indicating anything otherwise. But that is how they were moved out, so that he could walk across the street with his staff for that moment with the Bible.
It's precisely the wrong way to handle that. Peaceful protesters have a right to be there. I saw what happened. I was watching CNN when all of a sudden the troops moved forward and then they started pushing the protesters, throwing tear gas canisters. This is not the way we behave in the United States. Our law enforcement are out there on the streets trying to protect people. They're not, at least here in Chicago, we're not in the business of trying to put down peaceful protest.
Governor, tell me more about your phone call that you had with the president today.
Well, we listened for a while as the president said some, frankly, outlandish things, crazy things. He talked about dominating the streets in all of our cities today. And then, after he said all of that, there were a few governors, mostly Republican governors, who got on and said, positive, complimentary things about the president. And I couldn't believe that nobody was calling him out on his rhetoric. And so when I was called on, I just had to say what I said, expressing the values of the people of Illinois. We're a state that produced Barack Obama in the presidency. We produced Abraham Lincoln, Ulysses S. Grant. We have a long history of standing up for equality and against racial injustice. And it's time that more people stood up and said something, because this president every day, and I've said it from the beginning, the man is a racist, a misogynist, a homophobe, a xenophobe. He's got to go.
So I want to play, as we're watching this, your exchange with the president when you called out his rhetoric, his inflammatory rhetoric, as you called it, and what he said in response. Here it is.
Well, thank you very much, Jake. I don't like your rhetoric like this because I watched coronavirus, and I don't like your rhetoric like either. I think you could have done a much better job, frankly. But that's okay. We don't agree with each other.
So what did you want to, then tonight he comes to the Rose Garden, and you heard him. He refers to it as an angry mob. He says, "I am your president of law and order." Did anything he say in the Rose Garden show that he in any way heard what you said?
No, it's clear that he doesn't listen to anyone that tells him the truth. I did tell him the truth. This rhetoric, this inflammatory rhetoric, is bad for the country. When we had the riots in Ferguson, President Obama started to bring the temperature down. He talked about calling for calm. When Martin Luther King was killed, Robert Kennedy stood up and talked about seeking justice, and bringing the tension down within the country. This president doesn't understand any of that. He probably hasn't read any of that, knows no history, and doesn't understand the job of the president to truly speak to the values of the nation.
So you said on that call, he said that you all needed to dominate the protesters. That's what he said, and that fits with what he just said here. But I just want to be clear, when he says every governor should deploy the National Guard in full, that's what he said in the Rose Garden. That's what he wants you to do. I guess the first question is, do you plan to do that, Governor Pritzker?
Well, we have called out the National Guard to be a support mechanism for our local law enforcement. And they're doing that, frankly, and they're doing a good job. We also have our state police assisting local law enforcement all across the state, wherever they have requested it. So the president just doesn't know what he's talking about. And when he says in every state, well, what if there aren't any riots in every state? What if there aren't any there isn't any violent behavior or looting? I think he just wants to create a tone in which, it's law and order versus people standing up for their rights, and he'd just as soon run over people's rights.
So, Governor, what will you do if he does, he says he's mobilizing the U.S. military, but he says that if you don't solve the problem, he will deploy the U.S. military quickly and solve the problem for you. You've categorically said you reject his ability to send U.S. military to the state of Illinois, but what will you do if he tries to move forward?
Well, it's illegal. Jeffrey Toobin just confirmed what I have known, which is it's illegal. He can't do it. We won't request military assistance here in the state of Illinois. I can't imagine any governor is going to do that. And it's ridiculous. The situation that we're in today is one which requires a leader who will stand up and meet the challenge, by the way, of addressing police accountability, making sure that we're standing up for peaceful protest. Yes, of course, we want looters to go to prison, to jail. We want to make sure that we're catching people who are lighting fires or causing any violence. But the vast majority of people who are out there in Washington, D.C. and here in Illinois are standing up for peaceful protest and standing up against what happened in Minneapolis to George Floyd.